The All Blacks may have opened their rugby's greatest rivalry tour with a convincing 38-21 victory over the Stormers, but the result has been followed by a very different conversation. One about discipline, refereeing, and whether New Zealand can afford to give away so many opportunities when the Springboks series arrives. Former All Black star Sir John Kirwan has become one of the most outspoken voices on the issue, admitting that he was frustrated by the officiating during the Cape Town clash and saying he hopes New Zealand does not encounter what he described as overly pedantic refereeing in the upcoming tests. The comments have added another layer to what was already a fascinating opening match for Dave Rennie and his All Black side. New Zealand eventually pulled away from the Stormers with a strong late surge, scoring 3 tries in a 10-minute period after the hour mark, but the match was far from straightforward. The Stormers stayed within striking distance for long periods, while the All Blacks repeatedly made life more difficult for themselves through penalties and yellow cards. Anton Lienert-Brown, Simon Parker, and Josh Moorby all spent time in the sin bin, leaving New Zealand to play with fewer than 15 players at different stages of the contest. For an All Blacks team preparing for the ultimate challenge against South Africa, that lack of discipline immediately became one of the biggest talking points. Speaking on the Rugby Rivals podcast, Sir John Kirwan questioned several of the decisions made by English referee Carl Dixon, particularly the yellow cards. Kirwan made it clear that he did not believe the All Blacks were completely blameless. In fact, he acknowledged that New Zealand must improve its discipline and cannot expect to compete at the highest level while repeatedly giving opponents opportunities through infringements. But at the same time, he felt some of the decisions in Cape Town were marginal and described the overall refereeing performance as frustrating. That distinction is important because the debate is not simply about blaming the officials for New Zealand's problems. The All Blacks themselves recognized after the match that their discipline needed to improve. What Kirwan is questioning is whether some of the decisions were applied so strictly that they risk taking the game away from its natural flow. And that becomes particularly relevant when considering what lies ahead. The Springboks are not just another opponent. South Africa are renowned for their ability to apply pressure, control territory, and punish teams that make mistakes. Against a side of that quality, repeated penalties and cards could become extremely costly. The All Blacks may have escaped the Stormers' match with a 17-point victory, but the experience highlighted an area that Dave Rennie will almost certainly want to address before the next major challenge. The discussion became even more interesting when podcast host Ricardo Salizo offered another perspective. Rather than focusing entirely on whether the referee was too strict, Salizo pointed to the direction in which modern rugby is moving. World Rugby has increasingly emphasized the role of match officials and television match officials, or TMOs, in making sure important decisions are reviewed and applied correctly. From that perspective, the responsibility also falls on the players to adapt. If teams know that officials and TMOs are going to take a closer look at certain incidents, then players have to become smarter and more disciplined in those situations. That is the challenge facing the All Blacks. They cannot control how every referee interprets a law, but they can control their own actions. Kirwan agreed with that point, accepting that New Zealand must improve its discipline while continuing to question whether every incident in Cape Town deserved the level of punishment it received. That balance could prove crucial in the weeks ahead. One of the biggest moments under discussion involved Josh Moorby, whose involvement in a try-saving situation resulted in a penalty try and a yellow card. Kirwan was particularly critical of that decision, arguing that the player's actions represented a natural attempt to prevent an opponent from scoring. From his perspective, the incident did not appear malicious, and he questioned why the punishment needed to include both a penalty try and a yellow card. South African rugby great Victor Matfield, who also featured on the podcast, expressed similar concerns about the way the modern game is being officiated. However, Matfield also acknowledged that the direction of rugby is unlikely to change simply because players, coaches, or former internationals disagree with particular decisions. In his view, the use of TMOs is now an established part of the sport, with officials trying to reach the correct decisions even when that process can slow the game down. His argument was not necessarily that technology should be removed, but that the decision-making process needs to be faster and more efficient. That is an issue many rugby supporters will recognize. Technology can help officials make difficult calls, but the challenge is finding the right balance between accuracy and the natural rhythm of the sport. Every stoppage changes the momentum of a match, and long reviews can sometimes make a fast-moving game feel slower. The All Blacks, however, have little choice but to adapt. If the same approach is used during the Springboks series, New Zealand will need to be prepared for close scrutiny in every area of the game. High tackles, breakdown infringements, line-out offenses, deliberate knock-ons, and other moments can quickly become decisive when two of the world's strongest rugby nations meet. That is why the Cape Town match could ultimately become a useful lesson for Dave Rennie. The victory itself was important. Starting a major South African tour with a win gives the squad confidence, and the way New Zealand finished the match showed their ability to build pressure and find another level when the contest was still close. But the performance also exposed areas that need attention. The yellow cards in particular changed the shape of the game and forced the All Blacks to defend with fewer players. Against the Stormers, New Zealand managed to recover. Against the Springboks, the margin for error could be far smaller. Sir John Kirwan's comments therefore raise a question that will remain relevant throughout the tour. Can the All Blacks adjust quickly enough to avoid putting themselves in situations where refereeing decisions become match-defining? The answer may depend less on the officials than on how New Zealand responds to the modern interpretation of the laws. If the All Blacks are disciplined, they reduce the number of opportunities for referees and TMOs to intervene. If they continue to give away avoidable penalties, then even decisions that appear marginal can become significant. That is where Dave Rennie and his coaching staff have an important job to do. The goal should not simply be to complain about officiating, but to understand exactly what the officials are looking for and make sure the players are prepared. The best teams adapt to the conditions of the game, and against South Africa, that adaptability could be just as important as attacking ability or defensive strength. There is also a wider debate here about where rugby is heading. Victor Matfield suggested that the governing body's priority is getting decisions right, even if that means greater TMO involvement. Sir John Kirwan, meanwhile, wants the game to retain a degree of common sense and believes not every incident should automatically result in the maximum available punishment. Both perspectives highlight the same underlying issue. Rugby is constantly trying to balance player safety, consistency, technology, and the flow of the contest. That balance is not always easy to achieve. For the All Blacks, the immediate priority is much simpler. They need to take the lessons from Cape Town and turn them into better discipline. The victory over the Stormers showed that New Zealand have the attacking power to create pressure and score points in quick bursts. But the match also showed how quickly their momentum can be disrupted when they lose players to the sin bin. Anton Lienert-Brown, Simon Parker, and Josh Moorby were all involved in incidents that contributed to that difficult period, and those moments will provide valuable material for the coaching staff to review. There is no guarantee that future officials will make identical decisions, and it would be impossible to predict exactly how the Springboks tests will be refereed. But the All Blacks can control one thing: their discipline. That may be the biggest takeaway from the entire debate. Sir John Kirwan may hope the All Blacks avoid what he considers pedantic refereeing, but the safest strategy for New Zealand is to make sure they leave as little room as possible for controversial decisions to affect the outcome. As the tour moves forward, the pressure will only increase. The Springboks will provide a completely different challenge, and every mistake is likely to be examined closely. For Dave Rennie, the Cape Town victory is therefore both a positive result and a warning. The All Blacks have shown they can win, they have shown they can respond to pressure, and they have shown they can finish strongly. Now they need to show that they can remain disciplined when the intensity rises. And perhaps that is the most important lesson from Sir John Kirwan's criticism. Whether supporters agree with his assessment of the officiating or not, his comments underline a reality that the All Blacks cannot ignore. Modern rugby demands discipline, adaptability, and an understanding of how the laws are being applied. Against the Stormers, New Zealand were able to overcome their setbacks and finish with a comfortable-looking scoreline. Against the Springboks, they may not receive the same second chances. The debate over refereeing will continue, but for the All Blacks, the focus now has to be on what they can control. If they can clean up their discipline, stay composed under pressure, and adapt to the officiating environment, they will give themselves the best possible chance of competing in the biggest matches ahead. The Cape Town win was an encouraging start, but it also delivered a clear message. The closer the All Blacks get to the Springboks series,